Hello, my name is Rose James, and I'm the Program Manager for the Scott County Historical Society. And today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the history of Prohibition in Scott County. First, just to give you a little bit of context about who we are, the Scott County Historical Society has a mission to search, save, and share the history and cultural heritage of Scott County. Our building is located in downtown Shakopee, and we have rotating galleries of exhibits, and we also have a research library where we hold Scott County newspapers, cemetery records, maps, and all sorts of information that you can use to research Scott County history or your family in Scott County. We also maintain a 1908 historic house where we host tours and field trip programs. Now, normally we have programs and events all over the county, one of which is a series of Scott County history talks that we call Scott County Stories. Right now, that's a little bit hard, so we're bringing those to you in a digital form. Now, normally we'd have lots of time for questions, for people to make comments. So if you have any questions that come up during this presentation, take a look on the screen. You'll see our phone number and our email address. So don't hesitate to let us know, and we'll do our best to get back to you. But to keep to the topic of hand, today we're going to be talking about Prohibition. So I'm going to spend the first half of this presentation taking a look at the history of Prohibition in the United States, just to kind of give you some context. And then we're going to zoom into Scott County, and we're going to explore how Prohibition impacted the county through looking at photographs and newspaper headlines from the Prohibition era. So to get, I want to look a little bit at the history of alcohol consumption in the United States, because alcohol consumption is firmly entwined with U.S. history. In the early 17 and 1800s, almost everyone drank, regardless of age or gender. Alcohol just didn't have the context or some of the social stigma that it has today. Puritans actually referred to alcohol in almost biblical terms, as a creature from God to be both feared and revered. Common in households were homemade fermented alcohols based on fruit, and everyone routinely drank with each meal, which was usually about 2 meals per day at the time. In fact, more beer than water was recorded as being loaded onto the Mayflower. So at that point in time, the average American consumed about 5.8 gallons of alcohol per year. And to put that into context, today the number is about 2.3 gallons. Now, by the mid-1800s, alcohol use in the United States had exploded. This was due to a lot of different factors. Partly, there was an increase in local supplies, and there were also some international relations at the time that meant less alcohol was being imported from other countries. In terms of local production, specifically the production of whiskey exploded. Now, whiskey was much higher proof than the wines, small beer, and fruit liqueurs that had been consumed previously. Not only that, but whiskey was cheap. In 1820, the average price for whiskey was around $0.25 a gallon, making it cheaper for people to buy than milk, beer, wine, coffee, or tea. Not only that, but people thought whiskey had some medicinal properties at the time. In fact, soldiers in the U.S. Army were given the equivalent of 2 shots per day as part of their rations. Now, in 1837, a British traveler named Frederick Marryat visited the United States, and he wrote about his experiences in a journal called Diary of America. So here's a quote about the alcohol use that he observed in the U.S. at the time. Quote, "I am sure the Americans can fix nothing without a drink. If you meet, you drink. If you part, you drink. If you make an acquaintance, you drink. If you close a bargain, you drink. They quarrel in their drink, and they make up with a drink. They drink because it's hot, and they drink because it is cold. If successful in elections, they drink and rejoice. If not, they drink and swear. They begin to drink early in the morning, and they leave off late at night. They commence it early in life, they continue it, and then they drop into the grave." So as you can see, even from an international perspective, America was beginning to have an alcohol problem. In fact, by 1830, American alcohol consumption had peaked at about 7.1 gallons per year per person. And remember, that's in comparison to what we see today, which is about 2.3 gallons per year per person. Unsurprisingly, many Americans began to notice health and social problems associated with this high alcohol consumption. And by the 1830s, movements began across the United States calling for temperance and alcohol reform. In 1838, the state of Massachusetts passed a temperance law which banned the sale of spirits in less than 15-gallon quantities. The thought was that with this, people would not be buying alcohol for home consumption, but instead only businesses or saloons would be able to purchase alcohol. Now, this law was repealed 2 years later, but what it did was set a precedent for legislation regulating personal alcohol use in the United States. These temperance societies became a common fixture in communities across the U.S. by the turn of the century. The first known temperance organization in Scott County actually started in 1875 and called itself the German Men's Temperance Society. One of the most famous of these groups is the Anti-Saloon League. They were established in 1893 as a state organization in Ohio, but they went national by 1906. They grew to be one of the most powerful prohibition lobbying organizations in the country. During this time, prohibition was also seen as a women's issue, and in fact was sometimes connected with the larger suffrage movement. If we go back and look at the 1700s again, in Puritan households, women were as likely to drink as men and in similar quantities. Women may have had different roles in the home than men in early America, but in a rural household, both did work all day connected to the home to keep and raise food and keep the family alive. But the U.S. was changing. And as the U.S. shifted from being more agrarian to more urban, women's roles changed with it. By the mid-1800s, urban life had really changed the culture. Men went to work and women stayed at home. As odd as it may seem to today's ears, at the time this was kind of a new concept. By the Victorian era, this had developed into what historians sometimes call a cult of domesticity. Basically, women were in charge of the home, and home was seen as a completely different and more moral sphere, separate from the working world of men. With this, alcohol consumption moved outside of the home into bars and saloons, and it also became associated heavily with men instead of women. This meant as nationwide alcohol consumption was at a high, instead of being equally consumed by everyone, men were consuming a majority of the alcohol as compared to women and children in the United States. Alcoholism began to be seen as a hugely destructive force on families as men controlled the money in this new urban economy, and if that money was going to alcohol, it wasn't necessarily going to needs in the home. By the late 1800s, the temperance movement was entwined with other progressive movements, specifically suffrage, but also movements such as child labor and education reform. Now, during this time, the United States was also on the tail end of a huge wave of immigration. This immigration came at a time when, as I mentioned earlier, traditional farm work was being replaced by more urban factory work. There were a lot of changes in culture that went with this, and some of these changes led to some discrimination against new immigrants. Saloons and the drinking culture that they fostered began to become associated with poverty and therefore immigration. From being viewed as community spaces, suddenly they were looked at as detrimental to some of the values of the society. This was really magnified during the First World War, when the U.S. was at war with Germany. Beer was a huge part of German culture, and you see this in a resistance to prohibition in Scott County with its large German population. In 1917, after the United States entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for producing food. This set yet another precedent for the later prohibition laws. During World War I, you also saw a lot of closure of saloons because people were worried as they were seen as a gathering place for German immigrants. Prohibition itself finally came to the United States in 1920 at the end of years of dramatic social movements and legislation to improve the state of people in the United States, including food safety laws, public school laws, food inspection regulation, voting for women, and a push against child labor. The 18th Amendment passed in January of 1919 and took effect in January of 1920. It banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. Note that the amendment says nothing about actual alcohol consumption. Many people stockpiled alcohol and drank it perfectly legally throughout Prohibition. In fact, alcohol was served regularly at the White House for social functions throughout Prohibition. The amendment did make some exceptions, specifically for medical and religious use of alcohol. In fact, the trade in medical alcohol and in sacramental wine boomed during Prohibition. Now, it was one thing to ban alcohol, But the new amendment also made no provisions for enforcement. Alcohol was still deeply a part of U.S. culture at the time, and in many parts of the United States, it was something that people were used to making and consuming at home. Honestly, those who wanted to keep drinking during Prohibition did, and they just found more and more inventive ways to do it. Now, the law officially providing for the enforcement of the 18th Amendment was called the Volstead Act. Its author was Andrew Volstead, pictured here, and he was a Minnesota native from Goodhue County. He was born to Swedish parents, he attended St. Olaf, and eventually became a U.S. senator and the head of the Judiciary Committee. At the time, Minnesota was heavily in favor of prohibition as a state. Scott County was actually an exception to that rule. Enforcement of prohibition was initially assigned to the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, and was later transferred to the Justice Department. The truth of the matter is that many law enforcement agencies simply lacked the resources to consistently and effectively enforce prohibition. Only $5 million was set aside across the United States for the newly formed Prohibition Bureau, and only 1,526 federal agents were assembled to enforce prohibition. Now, at this point, the U.S. population was about 110 million. So that was one agent for every 71,000 people. So this is where we get some of the terms we associate with prohibition. Good example is bootleggers. Now, the origin of this is the smugglers' practice of concealing bottles of alcohol in their boots. We also have speakeasies. Supposedly, this term comes from the practice of speaking quietly about such a place in public so as to not alert police or neighbors. Now, when we think about speakeasies, they're commonly associated with glitz and glamour, but honestly, most were low-key community affairs. A good example of this is the Rock Spring Cafe in Shakopee, which is pictured here. Now, it was a perfectly respectable cafe. In fact, if you look at the picture on the right, the woman on the far left of that photo was actually Elizabeth Rees, the mayor of Shakopee. It just happened to have some alcohol that was served in the basement. Because this law didn't specifically outlaw the consumption of alcohol, many U.S. citizens did have personal reserves of wine, alcohol, and beer. Just changed how people consumed it. For less wealthy Americans, drinking moved indoors into homes and basements, and because alcohol was illegal, it just became more expensive. In cities, drinking became a luxury and a mark of wealth. The average consumer was middle or upper class instead of working class, and the age of the cocktail party had begun. Prescriptions for alcohol were also issued freely, and consumption of sacramental wine increased by 800,000 gallons between 1920 and 1921. Unfortunately, there was a backlash to this. As alcohol production and consumption moved underground, it was more commonly associated with criminal elements, and that meant the money from alcohol use fueled other more destructive crimes. And even as this alcohol moved into wealthier circles and more prominent neighborhoods, the violence and crime associated with alcohol moved into working class neighborhoods because police activity actively encouraged drink suppliers to move to areas where they would be less seen or noticed. So this was the national stage for Prohibition. Now let's zoom in. Let's take a look at Scott County. So Scott County in the 1920s had huge German and Czech populations, and these were cultures that tended to be against Prohibition. So while the county, as we saw, did have temperance movements, and while the state of Minnesota as a whole really liked the idea of Prohibition, most people in Scott County were against the law. Now, Prohibition in Scott County didn't take the form of these Gatsby-esque soirees and high-speed chases with gangsters. Scott County residents were far more likely to have a few clandestine bottles with friends or a small still in a farmer's garage that was used to supplement their income. In fact, this picture right here was taken actually slightly before Prohibition in 1910, and it's a group of foundry workers enjoying a picnic on their day off. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at some stories from Scott County newspapers during the era of prohibitions and couple them with photographs from the Scott County Historical Society collections that will give you a slice of what life was like during the time for residents of Scott County. We're going to start at the beginning with 1920. So these are photos from 1920 taken in Scott County. And I have a headline for you from the Jordan Independent on August 26, 1920. Quote, A gasoline stove, a milk can, and 2 barrels filled with soaking barley and other indications that certain forbidden drinks are being manufactured are not sufficient reason for anyone other than the owner to destroy property. William Kohler, a farmer, was soaking feed for hogs, he told the court. Leo Meyer thought he was violating the Prohibition Act. Meyer destroyed the hog feed, and the court fined him $20, the amount of damages asked by Kohler. This is from the Shakopee Tribune, July 9, 1920. Shakopee received an unheralded visit from federal prohibition enforcement officers Saturday evening as a result of M.J. Doherty, local saloon man. He appeared before H.F. Price, prohibition enforcement chief in Minneapolis, on the charge of having moonshine liquor on his premises. Doherty said that he bought the liquor and he admitted to having colored the liquor and placed it in bottles. His case was taken under advisement. Now, this is the Shakopee Argus, July 30, 1920. A raid of Ed Theed's saloon Wednesday morning about 11 o'clock was staged with a number of features that the proprietor claims were unnecessary and not in keeping with the usual conduct of federal officers. Mr. Theed claims that men, 3 in number, entered his saloon while he was engaged in counting money, and that, without displaying their official badges or stating what their errand was, they ordered him to step out from behind the counter. One of the men advanced around the counter towards him and backed away, upon which a second man jumped over the counter and struck him in the face, at the same time applying vile language to him. The men searched the saloon, basement, and kitchen, but found no liquor. So you can kind of see here, it's not blatant, but you can see in the tone and the words used in these articles, the people of Scott County were not excited about prohibition. We're going to look at a year later, 1921. So this is a Shakopee Tribune article from March 24th. Another raid by federal agents was made here last Saturday afternoon. The victim of the raid was Linus Vierling, at whose place it was reported that quite a quantity of moonshine and homebrew was found by federal agents and destroyed. The open violation of the laws of the United States in regard to liquor has passed the joke stage. It is time for the citizens of Shakopee and Scott County to realize this fact. Another article from the Belle Plaine Herald, September 1st, 1921. Prohibition officers busy in Scott County. Prohibition enforcement officers have been busy in Scott County the past few days. Stills in the county southeast of Shakopee were raided Saturday and the owners were arrested. On Monday, raids were carried out in Jordan and Shakopee, retail dealers being arrested, 2 in each town. The Shakopee Tribune, October 13, 1921. Prohibition will lengthen lifespans by 4 years, said a temperance movement speaker. It will seem that much longer anyway, we say. So moving forward to 1922. Now this is an article from the Jordan Independent. And here you can really see that the people in Scott County were not necessarily pleased with prohibition. This is from March 9th. In a very well-attended meeting at the Jordan Commercial Club held at City Hall on Thursday night, the rejuvenated organization showed a very lively spirit and interest in public affairs. A resolution related to prohibition was introduced. It was a statement asserting that prohibition is a failure and calls upon Congress to enact such legislation ameliorating the terms, conditions, and prohibition of the Volstead Act. The action was passed without any dissenting votes. This is from the Jordan Independent, June 1st, 1922. It is reliably reported that a prohibition enforcement squad raided Belle Plaine last Saturday night and caught every soft drink dealer excepting one with illicit liquor. So moving forward to 1920. This is from the Shakopee Tribune on May 24th. Bootlegger fooled when he buys tea for liquor, says a headline. It's a mean man that would swindle a poor bootlegger. So prohibition is becoming a little bit of a joke. You can see these quips being published in the newspaper. Here's another one, 24. It's the Shakopee Argus, November 6th. In the good old days, it took years for a man to drink himself to death, but the modern man can catch up to him with just a few swigs out of a bottle of moonshine. So the dangers of prohibition were also beginning to be known in Scott County. Moving forward to 1925, March 19th, Belle Plaine Herald. A judge fined a man $200 and ordered him to the workhouse for 6 months for driving an auto on the street when he was so drunk he could scarce remember his name. Personally, we never like to see anyone in trouble with the law, but this thing of driving an auto while intoxicated is becoming a problem too serious to overlook. The public streets and public roads of this county must be safe. Now we have another article, so looking at 1926 and 1927. This first one is from the Shakopee Argus-Tribune. This is August 19th, 1926. Driving an automobile on our congested roads is a man-sized job for anyone with a clear brain, and the moon-fogged fellow at the steering wheel has no business in any car. The automobile is a mighty dangerous weapon in the hands of one of these fellows. An uninvited guest always sits beside the driver, the Grim Reaper. And here we've got an article from the Shakopee Argus-Tribune, June 16, 1927. As a rule, the drunken driver only wants one side of the road. Unfortunately, it is your side. So here we see as Prohibition lingered on, the tone is beginning to change. Instead of sensational raids or stubborn dissents to Prohibition, articles are beginning to look at the real problems that came with all of this illicit liquor. Specifically in Scott County, there was a lot of concern at this time about drunken driving and how it was impacting public safety. So let's jump to 1930. Now, by this point, Prohibition was just a fact of life. We're 10 years in. It wasn't headline news anymore. So this is an April 4th article from the Jordan Independent titled Americanism versus Prohibition. Americanism versus Prohibition was the general title given to a forum discussion at a mass meeting conducted in Mertz Hall in Jordan on Tuesday night. Mr. Richter explained that it is the purpose to bring a plan to the solution of the problems and perplexities that they charge to the 18th Amendment. Now we're looking forward to by 1932, many people in the United States were beginning to look hard at the repeal of Prohibition. The United States was embroiled in the Great Depression, and many people saw ending Prohibition as a way to stimulate the economy through the production and sales of alcohol. If you look at the newspaper articles in Scott County at that time, they began to take a decided partisan turn as to whether the political party thought that Prohibition should stay in place or whether they thought it should be repealed. So here we have an article from the Belle Plaine Herald. It's from February 11th, 1932. And this is an article sponsored by the Republican Party. It's titled, Argued Prohibition 50 Years Ago. Quote, 10 years ago, the German vote was stronger in Scott County, although the situation is probably the same today. But today we hear little complaint about Prohibition from the Germans. They seem to be taking it along without brewery beer just as well as the other nationals. Now, of course, a few may take a little homebrew on the side, but so do the Irish, French, Yankees, and others. Perhaps if pioneer legislators knew what was in store for their successors, they would have settled the liquor question once and for all. If they had banned liquor traffic in the far past, most of us would probably have little knowledge of or desire for intoxicants. Instead, we are working towards it. With the present method of enforcement, the day of real and total abstinence seems a long way in the future. Now you also have an advertisement. This is from the Shakopee Argus-Tribune, November 3rd, 1932. This advertisement is for a Democratic Party candidate. It states, repeal Prohibition, bring back beer and light wine. That is the Democratic ticket. It is a vote for repeal of the 18th Amendment, and it is a vote for the modification of the Volstead Law. Now, as many of you know, in 1933, Prohibition was repealed. So we've got some headlines here. The Shakopee Argus-Tribune, September 9th. Shakopee votes 10-1 for repeal. We also have New Prague votes 12-1 for Prohibition repeal. Now here's a few of the articles about how the end of Prohibition immediately impacted Scott County. So this is the Belle Plaine Herald, April 13th, 1933. The new beer industry got off to a flying start in Belle Plaine last Friday. A supply was at hand early in the morning, and all of the licensed retailers had a supply that looked big enough to meet any demand. However, by mid-afternoon, the supply was exhausted, so many who wanted to renew acquaintance with brewery beer after the long 14-year drought thought it looked as if folks would have to be put on a quota basis. Here's an article from the New Prague Times, June 11, 1933. New Prague Brewery will be remodeled. Work begins today. Today marks the first activities in the awakening and rejuvenation of this important New Prague industry that has been dormant for some years. Shakopyargis Tribune, July 20th, 1933. Brewery details near completion. Present plans provide for converting the old flour mill here into a modern brewery, the capacity of which has not been disclosed. Men in close contact with the undertaking have much enthusiasm and express confidence in a successful outcome. And on the screen here, you can see the votes for and against Prohibition for various towns and townships in Scott County. So you can see the people of Scott County being not really in favor of Prohibition trend continued all the way through, and most of the people in Scott County did vote to repeal Prohibition. So in this next section, we're going to look at Prohibition by the numbers. So statistics, facts, figures that show what Scott County looked like during the time of Prohibition and how Prohibition altered life in Scott County and in the United States as a whole. So for this first section, we're going to look at what voting in presidential elections looked like in Scott County during Prohibition. And one thing I want to take note of, I think a lot of people are aware of this, but the values and the party platforms represented by the Republican and the Democratic Party have changed a lot over time. And specifically during the 1920s and 30s, those party platforms were very fluid. So when you look at the names Republican and Democrat in the past, don't necessarily assume that that means that those parties had the same party platforms that you would see associated with them today. But in the 1920s, you can see that Scott County had a tendency to vote primarily Republican in presidential elections. But people were so opposed to Prohibition in Scott County that you can see by 1924 that had really flipped. And in fact, there was a socialist majority in the presidential election in Scott County during 1924. That was a particularly turbulent election year if you look back on the history. And in 1928 and 1932, you can see that Scott County residents voted primarily Democrat. And if you remember those articles that we looked at in the newspaper in the past, the Democratic Party was the one primarily opposing Prohibition at the time. So you can see what a big issue this was for residents of Scott County during the 1920s and 30s. Moving forward, just a peek at what ethnicities were primarily represented in Scott County. In 1930, as we said, the county was really heavily German and Czech. And then we have some other ethnicities that certainly had large groups, but you can see that German and Czech majority, and you can see that reflected in how opposed the county was to Prohibition. Just to show the population, there was a big surge in population growth during the time of Prohibition. In 1860, there were about 4,500 residents in Scott County. By 1930, the county was up to 14,000 residents, so quite a big surge in population. Now this is looking at the United States as a whole, and we've kind of said these numbers throughout this presentation, but just to zero in on how much Prohibition changed alcohol consumption in the United States. So in 1790, which is the earliest year we really have good statistics for, we're looking at about 5.8 gallons on average per person of alcohol consumed per year. And one thing that people often ask when they look at this is what people mean by alcohol being consumed. So, for example, in a statistics like this, beer and whiskey aren't being given the same weight. They're actually looking at 5.8 gallons of actual alcohol. And in beer, that would be much more diluted, for example, as opposed to straight whiskey. Now, by 1830, we're up to 7.1 gallons. That most people agree is the peak of alcohol consumption in the United States. 2016, so closer to today, the average is down to about 2.3 gallons, so lower than it was for most of the early history of the United States. This next statistic is looking at death by liver failure in U.S. men. And remember, during the time that Prohibition went into effect, even though this hadn't been true before this time, alcohol was generally centered in the male population more than the female population in terms of usage in the United States. So before Prohibition, we see about 29.5 or 30 men per 100,000 passing away due to liver failure in the United States. After Prohibition had been in effect for some time, that's down to 4.7. So even though we think of Prohibition as a time of partying and drinking, really overall alcohol usage in the United States went down significantly during that time. By the time of repeal, Prohibition really had fundamentally altered drinking culture in the United States. A lot of the stories we have about Prohibition emphasize its failures. We look at endless flows of bootleg gin and speakeasies and gangsters that were flouting the law. But there are a lot of changes that it brought about too. One of these changes had to do with how hard alcohol was viewed in the United States. Hard alcohol suddenly became more of a classy drink. Instead of being something that people drank in rural areas or something that people made at home, it was something that we mixed into cocktails, something that had a higher social stigma around it. Also, the creation of the cocktail, the culture of mixing alcohol instead of drinking it straight, really came into being during Prohibition. And that meant people were drinking less alcohol. They were watering it down with other substances in order to make it taste better. The amount of alcohol consumed in the United States, as we've seen, also went down during Prohibition, and it hasn't gone back up since. People really do drink much less in the US than they did before Prohibition. That being said, by the end of the 1920s, not just in Scott County, but in the country as a whole, support for Prohibition was waning. And especially the Great Depression really pushed Prohibition into the spotlight. People argued that bringing back the alcohol industry would create jobs, and it would really help bring back the economy of the United States. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected during the Great Depression, he ran on a platform of repealing Prohibition. Zooming, we can look at Prohibition's legacy in Scott County. So Prohibition led to an uptick of organized crime in the Twin Cities. And that really didn't come into Scott County as much during Prohibition, but after Prohibition, elements of that culture did move south. In the years following Prohibition, Shakopee had a brief period where it was known as Little Chicago for its illegal activity. And this activity primarily took the form of gambling. Part of this was due to the sheriff that was in charge of the city at a time, who had a financial arrangement with many casino owners. So when a raid was due in town, he would inform them in advance for a cut of the profit. So the few of the stories that came from that time, looking at the Rock Spring Cafe in Shakopee, remember it had a history as kind of being a low-key speakeasy during Prohibition. But during the period after Prohibition, that bar also added some slot machines in the basement. And there were actually safe houses nearby where those slot machines were moved when the establishment was warned of a police raid. Another infamous joint in Shakopee was the Mill Pond Club. So this was almost a Vegas-like gambling establishment. It was famous for having bulletproof walls, supposedly, and also having a safe house at the top of the parking lot, which even had gun portals in the walls in case of a firefight. Eventually, there was a changeover in police. Sheriff J.P. Weimer-Skirchen replaced the sheriff who had been more corrupt and started destroying slot machines. And by 1950, Shakopee's reputation as Little Chicago was at an end. So that's Prohibition in Scott County. As I said before, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and we'll do our best to answer them. We've got our phone number and email address right here on this slide. You can also find out a little bit more about the Scott County Historical Society on our website at scottcountyhistory.org. I also recommend that you follow us on social media, Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. We have games, trivia, and photographs from the Scott County Historical Society collection. Now, coming up at the Scott County Historical Society, as soon as we are able to open them, we're going to bring you some new exhibits. One is actually covering the history of Prohibition in Scott County. So you'll be able to see some of the artifacts from the Scott County Historical Society collections, as well as some of the photographs that we talked about in this presentation. Finally, I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us and watch this video today. Hopefully we'll be able to bring you some more videos from the Scott County Stories lecture series. I hope everyone is well and have a great day.